The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
And today we're going to talk about three saints who are obviously connected. We're going to talk about St. Monica, first of all, her son, St. Augustine, and also St. Ambrose, who baptized St. Augustine. So there's really a history of the saints that we're going to talk about. We're going to focus primarily first on St. Monica. She was a woman of a devout faith and obviously experienced difficulties in her life, not only in her personal life, but also in her life of faith related to her children. So let's try to set the scene. Basically, we're talking about the 300s in their life. So what was going on in the church at that time?
Well, we see in the church now it's legal, for all practical purposes to practice the faith. So it's no longer one of great division and one of great persecution. That's not to say that that doesn't still exist. Just because the emperor now says you no longer put to death, there is still persecution. What we find in Monica is very common. The persecution is no longer from the emperor. The persecution is within your own home. And so although she might have found comfort or companionship with other people of faith outside of her house, she's in a marriage and in a relationship and in a family where that is not valued. And so her persecution sadly comes from within. We could argue that that still goes on today. When people will persecute a parent or a child or a sibling because of their devotion and their need to be part of the church. But that certainly was sadly part of Monica's life. And I would say that Monica, just because kind of the exemplary model of what was going on in a lot of homes at that time.
Well, we know that to kind of name it more specifically, her husband was a rather violent man, a pagan. And his mother lived with them, who also was a pagan. And yet, for many years, Monica dealt with this and obviously put up with this, but also prayed about it and ultimately prayed for their conversion. And we see how there was a conversion of them, but also she prayed for her children. So what's interesting is not only her husband, her mother-in-law, but her three children are all warring against her, who's a devout Catholic Christian, but they are not. And so there's this struggle that continues. And don't you think that in most people's lives, they would have succumbed to that? They would have just given up?
Oh, I think many would, but I do think that it's also characteristic of someone of faith to not want to abandon someone. The desire for them to come to know what you have come to know. And so it's very hard, though many people do it, it is very hard to cut some of those relationships. We can't just so easily turn off our emotions. And so there was love for her husband, even though he could be violent, even though he was ill-tempered, even though he ridiculed her life of faith, there was some spark of love and affection there, and certainly for her children. And even if not for her husband or her mother-in-law, and we don't want to be mean about mother-in-laws, that was probably the most challenging relationship that she would have had in her house. But for her children especially, she wants them to know what she knows. She wants them to have this sense of faith and this sense of peace and this sense of happiness that has overtaken her life. And so she is struck with the decision to perhaps abandon them, or to continue the struggle. We've talked a lot about different missionaries. She again becomes a missionary in her own home. She's come to foreign land, trying to impart them messages of peace and hope that are foreign to their ears. And yet she constantly is of that resolve.
Well, it's interesting because she prays primarily for her children as well. And in the life of St. Augustine, we know that she prayed for 17 years for his conversion. We find that the prayer for her other two children was brought to fruition at a much quicker time. Both of them actually entered religious life. So her prayers not only were answered, but also there was almost icing on the cake, so to speak, that they chose to become men and women religious, to carry on this faith that their mother had instilled in them. But doesn't it say something about perseverance as well? You know, when we look at the life of people around us and how they struggle and how they pray for things and how things are left unanswered, doesn't Monica give a sense of an example to the perseverance of prayer and how prayers ultimately can be answered?
Oh, absolutely. And I would think that there are a great many conversion stories that are more because of the perseverance. We even hear it in Scripture about that the Lord will be generous because of one's perseverance, not necessarily because they understand. But there are many stories of conversion where someone doesn't fully understand the scriptures that are being taught to them or the different dogmatic teachings of Christ or the Blessed Mother. But what they are most struck by is the perseverance and the example of the person who is seeking to bring Christ to them. And what then motivates them isn't that they have it all figured out, but if there's something so valued in this life of Christ, that you will not abandon that mission, then there must be something about it that I want for myself. And I think that is what Monica ultimately offered her children and what she offers us in her example.
What's interesting is that she prayed for all of these years for her husband, her mother-in-law, her children, and finally the last one that agrees or that kind of steps over the threshold to embracing the faith, Augustine, that once he is baptized and converted, that she dies. You know, so maybe that was her main goal in life, her mission in life was to bring about the conversion of her family. And ultimately, we see in her son Augustine, who we'll talk about in just a moment, this whole sense of faith celebrated and come to fruition and also lasting throughout the centuries. And that was really her legacy, was to bring this about, and also through her death. And that's ultimately the life of the saint, isn't it?
I think of, just briefly, I think of that ending story of her life. I often think of Simeon when he embraces the Christ child in the temple and says, "Now you may let your master go." We all have our purpose to serve, and Monica's purpose was to bring her entire family to faith. She accomplished her purpose, and now she's a saint for all the ages.
And isn't that oftentimes the lot of a mother? You know, to pray for her children, to wish well for her children, and to see them succeed, and if they are Christian, to see them grow in the life of the church. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
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 That's Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll. Their numbers are growing. More than a year ago, more than a decade ago. More people now living in this state than nearly any state in the Union. 1 out of every 10 families in America. 1 out of every 6 children in America. 33 million Americans teetering on the brink of hunger, sickness, hardship. 33 million Americans descending into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about the son of St. Monica, St. Augustine. St. Augustine's life was such that he really hesitated to embrace the faith. And I would say that back in his time, that was pretty typical, don't you think? That they believed that one was baptized and then one died. And so there's this whole sense that one converted at the last minute. And so they led this whole gratuitous life up until the time that they knew that it was not going to continue. And that was really typical of Augustine's life, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think as if we were to read some of the more salacious details of his life, he really, it appears, went out of his way to work against his mother's prayers and to work against this life. But as you said, almost this sense of, I'm going to cram everything possible in before the end. So I think sometimes we'll just hear a life of dissolute is what they'll put in little commentaries or that to try to gloss it over. But to make no mistake, it was not a good life by any means. He invited all kinds of vices and all kinds of behaviors and was willing to try anything once, as the phrase nowadays might be. But you're right, it was all perhaps not so much against his mother or a desire to reject all of that, but that sense that once he would be baptized, the life he knew would be over. And that really was a struggle for him. Not that he was a horribly bad person. He invited a lot of this bad behavior into his life, but that struggle of giving up what he's experiencing and the pleasure that he has now to die.
There's this whole sense that, to kind of live life to its fullest, but not in a good sense. And I'm wondering if that's kind of typical about life today for many people. We live life, everything's there for the taking. Everything's there at our fingertips. We can have what we want without sometimes consequences. And so that really was Augustine's life. Kind of relating it to the prodigal son. He wanted it all. He wanted it until at some point he knew that the life that he was living was no longer his, but the life he was living, in Paul's words, was Christ, living in him. And so we know in his life that he became a greater person because of this conversion to his faith. And we know that significant to him not only was his mother, who prayed long and hard for his conversion to the faith, but also the one who ultimately baptized him and brought him this new life through the sacrament. And we'll talk about St. Ambrose in the last segment of our show today. But let's go back to St. Augustine. He was Bishop of Hippo in North Africa for 34 some years. So his life as a bishop in the life of the church was long. And so his life also was very significant because he had done many things. So it wasn't necessarily the end of his life that he chose conversion, but he had many years yet left. And so we see this whole sense of being part of the history of the church in the Western church, building up in his life and also continuing in the lives of others.
I think one of the things that we look at in Augustine too, and certainly not that we want anybody to invite his early life into their own pattern of living, but perhaps after his conversion, he didn't just reject the knowledge that he had. And perhaps then his role of the church was to guide and help others through their choices, through their stumblings, through their fallings. I'm reminded when I was a teacher, I taught with a woman who had been valedictorian of her class in high school. And she had the most challenges as a teacher because she had never not gotten it. And to be in a classroom with some children who didn't get it was a challenge for her. Everything came easily academically, and so some children did very well with her, but many children did not. And I'm not advocating that everybody should go out and live the life of Augustine, but perhaps in his writings, in his homilies, in just how he carried himself as a man of God and as a man of the church, was certainly affected and influenced by what he himself had to overcome. He understood other people's struggles, but not leaving them there. Not saying, oh, it's all right, everybody makes mistakes, but now here's what you need to do to overcome that. And I think that was perhaps, if we want to embody that into his one legacy, that's the greatest gift.
What's interesting is that in his life, we don't necessarily hear about his brother and sister who also entered religious life. But I'm wondering if that would have been typical back then for everyone in the family to become a priest or a religious sister. You know, that was probably atypical back then. So I'm wondering if that says something more about the perseverance and perspicacity of someone like Monica, who prayed diligently, not only for her children's conversion, but prayed so fervently that they entered religious life. I mean, isn't that almost an interesting sidebar of prayer itself?
Oh, I think it's very interesting. And, you know, one of the things why we maybe don't hear too much about the two of them is their conversion came earlier. They would have been in religious life. Religious life then is certainly different than it is now. Now one can join religious life, but they have the freedom to visit family, and they can get in the car and go on vacation with family, and sometimes they can even not live at the monastery or the convent when a parent is aging and needs someone to be with them. But the model of religious life then would have been you would leave your family and you would be part of this new family. And so wherever they might have found themselves, we don't know how often they might have ever been able to get back together again. And it is because of his role as a bishop, beyond that as a member of a religious community, that we hear and know more. Certainly very rare to have three in one family, though we have stories in our own diocese of maybe two brothers were priests. But I think the pattern eventually became, at a certain point in the life of the church, especially in Eastern European families, you'd have large families and one would go to the convent until one stayed. One would go to the seminary until one stayed. So you might have always had an aunt or an uncle that was a nun or a priest, but to have the vast majority of them be in religious life was unique.
And I would say that probably the brother and sister might have been in monastic life, so they would never really have had any relationship with the family beyond that. We're going to talk now about another saint, but before we do that, we're going to take a quick break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Light Moments. Here's Father Tom McSweeney.
Jack Canfield, co-author of the book Chicken Soup for the Soul, was driving home from work when he passed a park where two Little League teams were playing baseball. And he decided to watch, and he took a seat on the bench behind first base. When he asked one of the boys what the score was, the youngster responded with this big smile that his team was behind 14-0. And Mr. Canfield, surprised by the boy's happy mood, asked him why he wasn't discouraged. And the boy looked puzzled and said, well, why should we be discouraged? We haven't even been up to bat yet. In this child's eyes, nothing was impossible. If the other team could score 14 runs in one inning, so could his team. And the same holds true in our lives. There are times when things seem to go wrong and we seem to be beaten, but human beings have the ability to make a comeback. With faith in yourself and with God's help, all things are possible.
This message from the Christophers.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. A place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. Where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will give you shelter after a flood. That place is called America, where we look out for each other, When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about another significant person in the life of St. Augustine and obviously St. Monica, and that is St. Ambrose. St. Ambrose was the bishop who baptized Augustine. And when we talk about the baptism, we know it took place on Easter Sunday. It actually took place in the year 387, and it took place in the Cathedral of the Duomo in Milan. I actually had an opportunity to visit the undercroft of the cathedral there, and the actual font where Augustine was baptized by Ambrose doesn't look anything like any of the baptismal fonts in our churches today. It's very crude, almost just a kind of a shell, but a very significant place amidst this whole gorgeous cathedral is this piece of antiquity that's there for us to remember and recall that significant moment in the life of this saint. St. Ambrose is important because he, like St. Augustine, is what we would consider part of the Western Church, two Western theologians, and then St. John Chrysostom and Athanasius would have been part of the Eastern Church. As a matter of fact, if you go to the Vatican and you see the chair of St. Peter, that's right below the alabaster window of the Holy Spirit, those four saints are holding up the chair of Peter. So there's this whole sense that these Western and Eastern theologians are the foundation of the chair of Peter and continue the life of the church and the salvation of the church. So what more do we want to share with the folks about Ambrose?
Well, I think one of the things to note is that he was himself a very devout, very faithful person, and that it was recognized by the people. Nowadays, if a diocese is to receive a new bishop, there's usually a little waiting period. There's this whole secret process of certain priests and other people in diocese can offer names, and they get reviewed, and then eventually a name is selected by the Holy See through the congregation for bishops. Ambrose was acclaimed by the people of Milan to be their leader. That's very, very rare in the life of the church. But what that says is that he was recognized not just for his knowledge, but what do people really want? Very few people are going to acclaim having the most knowledgeable person. They want someone who feels their pain, feels their suffering, feels their joy, someone they can connect with, but who also ultimately is someone who can lift them up. And so all of these things were going on in Ambrose's life and were recognized by the people to the point that he's 33 years old. Now, admittedly, back then, that's a little older than 33 now, given life expectancy, but still to be elevated to that role by the acclamation of the people says a great deal about who he was and who he was seen to be.
And I would imagine that he had some influence in the life of Augustine as well. Not only his mother, St. Monica, but also Ambrose. And I would imagine that under his tutelage that he became the person who he was through the prayers, through the example, through the mentorship of Ambrose. And what does that say for us in the church today of how we are to be examples for others? You know, certainly we know that the saints themselves are examples for us in this modern world, but how are we to be examples for others as well?
Well, I would say that probably if we wanted to divide Monica and Ambrose, we would see that Monica is probably more responsible for his initial conversion, but Ambrose would have been more responsible for his vocation, in the church, to emulate after that life that Ambrose offered. That certainly is true for us in the church today. It is a different church. What are people looking for in priests? What are they looking for in religious? I think they're looking for people who know Scripture and who know the teachings of the church, but who can apply it in a pastoral sense. I think they are looking more for co-workers, certainly not reducing our role as priests or as leaders of the congregation, but they're looking more for that sense of coworker. I find people more impacted by being able to say, well, Father's out there working at this, so I should be willing to volunteer some of my time, more than, oh, Father just stands up there and says, I need to do this or she needs to do that. Even though it's changed, I would think it's still the same in the sense that people look to others, especially those who've been called to a role of leadership and discipleship in the church, for the example to follow. Augustine followed it from Ambrose and from his mother Monica, and we need to recognize how many people are we hopefully inviting on the journey now.
I think the other thing when we talk about Augustine and Ambrose is that we're talking about the early church. We're talking about shortly after, or at least maybe 100 years after, the legalization of Christianity in the world. So we're talking about a very young church. Obviously the church goes back to Jesus Christ and his institution of that, but yet the institution of the church, was fairly new and fairly young in the lives of these two saints, Augustine and Ambrose, and how they were instrumental and significant in not only carrying on the faith and nurturing the faith, but also being an example. And I would think that the people who publicly acclaimed Ambrose as the bishop in Milan were people who were fervently tied to the faith, and people who were fervently practicing their faith. And how when we look at these saints, we look at examples, we look at people who we could follow and also strive to fervently practice the faith as well. We've got about a minute left in the show. Any final comments that you'd like to make, not just about Ambrose, but about Augustine or Monica as well?
Well, I think as we look at the three of their lives, and you talked now about the institution of the church, and that it was relatively new, we could argue that a form of institution came to the church when Jesus declared Peter the rock and the foundation. It has taken different forms and different shapes, and in every generation we're called to continually mold and shape that institution. What bothers me is when people reject an institutional church, and we need to just go back to the way things were with Jesus. But as I've just said, Jesus gave us an institutional church. He gave it to humans. We're not always perfect. We see in Augustine, he was not perfect. And yet he's able, through his discipleship and his conversion, to craft in his time an institution that lasts much longer. None of us are perfect, but we work together to craft something that will last into the future and ultimately lead us to salvation.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.